Hey guys, what's up? It is Nathan here. And today I'm doing a little bit of a different video because I am kind of going over in my what I have been working on for a while. I've been working on a few uniforms. I've been trying to get involved with living history and some forms of reenactment and just historical education. Because history has been something that's been really interesting to me for a long time. It's kind of been my hyperfixation, actually. So this is actually something that I've been working on for a while. I've been working on a uniform. It's a World War One German uniform. I've wanted to do some living history stuff for a while, and now I finally have the opportunity to. So I'm just kind of going over this uniform. This is a World War One officer's uniform for the German infantry. Specifically, this is a grenadier's uniform. This is a part of the second or third, depending on how you want to delineate them. But it's the part of the second grenadiers regiment, based out of East Prussia, formed around the city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad. It was formed well before World War One briefly, and then it was reconstituted shortly before World War One started. It was nicknamed the Friedrich Wilhelm the Second, and so it was specifically instituted as an infantry regiment or as a grenadier regiment, and it served throughout World War One. It specifically served in several key battles, including the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, and then also served in the Battle of Verdun in 1916, as well as the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. So there's a whole bunch of history behind this particular group, and so this is just something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and this is the regiment I've chose to portray. Now I am portraying a captain of the East Prussian Grenadiers, the Second East Prussian Grenadiers, and so this is kind of the equipment and the uniform that they would be wearing at the start of the war, around the Battle of Tannenberg. Now this is closer to like this is an officer's uniform, so it's not like it would be worn exactly like this in the field, but it's pretty close. So as with most uniforms, we'll start with what I am wearing on my feet. In this case, I'm wearing a pair of riding boots. Now, these look very similar to jack boots. They're just taller, and the reason is because officers would wear their own private purchased riding boots as opposed to the jack boots or the ankle boots that most German soldiers would be wearing. And this also doubles. In fact, the lower half of this has a second purpose, which is the fact that I am also working on a cavalry officer's uniform. And so these breeches and boots are also what would be worn by cavalry officers for most of the war, actually. And eventually, some officers would eventually start to wear puttees. They wouldn't wear riding boots for the entirety of the war, but they did wear them for most of the war. So that is the start of the uniform. Like I said, I'm also wearing breeches. While most uniforms were made of wool, officers' uniforms were privately purchased, and so they were actually made of either finer quality wool or gabardine, like mine is. And so they were more tailored. And so that's part of it. There are riding breeches because officers, I guess, just favored riding breeches at the time. Eventually, trousers would actually take over the German military, but for now, there were still officers that wore the actual Jodhpurs or breeches that the German military is relatively known for, well known for, I should say. Their tunic is a model 1907/10. So this was what would have been rolling out shortly before World War One and would have been worn by officers at the very start. And it would eventually, basically, all of over the course of the 4 years of the war, basically all of the color would be drained out of the tunic. You know, the red piping would eventually go away. The gold buttons would eventually go away and give way to silver and then green. Um, and the only officers that would keep color were senior officers, your generals, your colonels, that would be in charge of more operations on the field. And then or behind the lines, I should say. So a lot of this, and you see this with the British officers too, a lot of the ornate detailing would go out in favor of the utilitarian. You see this with basically every officer in Europe throughout the war: Russia, Germany, Britain, France, Italy, and so you see that, and that's where a lot of this eventually goes. But at the start of the war, it is still fairly common, especially among officers. And then on the shoulders, you can see I have my shoulder boards, which are the color of the Prussian infantry, and have the two rank pips to designate that I am a captain. And then they're on both sides. And you also have this, which is an infantry lanyard. It's a marksmanship lanyard. So, as an officer, the person who would wear this uniform would probably have been uh, at least having a few years of experience prior to World War One. Probably he would have come from the aristocracy, and so would have been able to attend like a military academy. So it has the marksmanship lanyard on the side, as well as the only other medal that I have. I do have a space for an Iron Cross First Class, but I am wearing an Iron Cross Second Class, which was a quite common medal for military merit throughout World War One and eventually World War Two. But this is the World War One version, which was reconstituted in 1914. And so this officer would have definitely had some experience, and it wouldn't have been unheard of for people like this, officers like this, to have been handling logistics and field operations early on in the war. But there are instances of people with the rank of captain or even higher charging into no man's land with their troops. And so that's something else to keep in mind. And then on my side, as far as equipment goes, on my side, I have a 190 or not 190. I have a 1907 canteen and a M1897 colored bread bag. This was for rations. Um, in the case of officers, they usually didn't move too far from their trenches, so the bread bag was often discarded, or at least, I mean, they would also have a rucksack of some variety, and so this was a way to carry around their rations if they needed to. And that was also where a lot of officers would store other random things, especially especially in the field. So it would serve as a kind of a makeshift like musette bag, with other supplies, potentially spare ammunition, stuff like that. And that was one of the things that was very common to have in their bag. It also, like I showed, has a canteen, and so that would be where they would have stored their water. Contrary to popular belief, most of the German army did not have access to alcohol. Now, it was provided, especially to the Bavarian section of the German army, but it was not widely. It was not given widely. Like in the case of the French army, champagne and wine were pretty common. In the German case, beer was not provided very often at all, um, unless you were a part of the Bavarian section. And so that is this side, which is supplies. Like I said, they would also have potentially a rucksack. The other thing is that German officers, in my case, like for an infantry regiment, they would not be carrying swords. In fact, most officers would not be carrying swords. There were officers that did carry swords, and they were mainly within artillery crews um, and artillery regiments, but they were not widespread. Especially in the case of officers. You know, British officers carried swords quite a bit, but the German officers did not because of a variety of reasons. Swords were not as widespread. Even cavalry officers, they wouldn't carry swords on their person most of the time. Usually, actually, and I'll get into this when I finish my cavalry uniform, those officers didn't have swords on them because, unlike the British officers, because the sword sheath was actually connected to their saddle. And so lancers and cavalry did not carry those weapons on them, unlike the British cavalry at the time. So instead, what my primary weapon as an officer, as a field officer, would be a pistol. And in the case of the German army, one of the main pistols that was used by officers and NCOs was the Luger P08, and it was adopted in 1908 by the German army, and it was made in the late 1890s in 1898, but it was adopted in 1908, and it was a it's a very well-known pistol of World War One and World War Two. Um, for all of my Band of Brothers fans, you know that the Luger actually plays a major role in several scenes of Band of Brothers, particularly with Hubler, and also the scene where the German officer offers Major Winters his Luger, and Winters does not accept. And one of the things that I find interesting about this holster is that this is a pattern holster that was made throughout both World Wars, and it's basically identical between the two. However, one of the things that it has is a pull tab right here, which you pull, and it's supposed to give the opportunity for the officer to be able to draw the pistol. Now, this, you might be wondering, how do I have a Luger? Because Lugers are very expensive. This is a Denix replica of the Luger, so it looks very, very similar to a Luger, and it's perfect for holster filler. But it operates very similar, but it is not an original Luger. I wish I had one. It is not. Also, I would also like to mention that a lot of officers would probably, much like the rest of the uniform, they would not be provided this when they first are commissioned. They would have probably private purchased it. And so a lot of the equipment would be privately purchased, and the same goes for the pistol. In fact, my uniform is not 100% common when it comes to how officers would have set their equipment up. The general layout is quite common, but a lot of them had smaller frame, private purchased, smaller caliber pistols. The Luger was a service pistol, and as such was generally considered to be quite reliable, but also quite common, but also not particularly great for officers. And so, whereas the British and well, specifically the British, their main service pistol was the Webley Mark IV and Mark VI, which were very common and were used quite a bit in World War One by officers, regardless of whether they purchased their gear privately or not. In the Germans' case, they would probably go with different uniform or different pistols standards. Also, a lot of soldiers and officers favored the Mauser C96, which was still being used at this time. But most of the time, the Mauser was not used as much by officers. It was mainly because it was heavy, it was larger, it was more unwieldy. So usually, if officers had to choose one of the main service pistols, they would have favored the Luger. And since the days of the Walther PPK were long in the future, that this was considered one of the most reliable. Now we also see a similar kind of thing going. They also have revolvers. The Reich's revolver was used a lot in this time, but they were not used to the same extent as even the Luger and the Mauser were. There's a reason why the Luger is so ubiquitous, and you even see like artillery versions of the Luger. You see artillery versions of the Mauser with stocks, and like with the Luger, you see longer barrels. You see the drum magazine or the snail drum, the trommel, which sucks and is eventually used on the MP18. Sucks there too, but the Luger there's a ton of different versions. You know, there were longer barrels made for the Navy. There were even longer barrels made for cavalry and for artillery, and that's where the trommel and the stock eventually get introduced later in the war. And so the Luger is a very famous pistol, and so that's why I chose it, because it's one of the most recognizable, and because it's not unheard of for an officer to just choose a basic service pistol. Now, in the case of my headgear, this is another thing that when going into battle specifically on the front lines, I would not be wearing this headgear even at the start of 1914. I'd be wearing a Pickelhaube. But this is in officers, the 1907 officers Fedmütze, which is the field cap, and would be worn for either walking out or for like staff, like logistical staff stuff. Same with the collar tabs. They were basically just same with the shiny shoulder boards. They were basically just like, here I am, pick me, I'm a junior officer. Junior officer casualty rates and during World War One were incredibly high on basically every front. And the Germans quickly realized that getting rid of these, or at least toning them down, was incredibly useful. And so you see that they even get rid of the red cap band, and that kind of goes with the theme of getting rid of basically any bright colors on the tunic as the war drags on. So a lot of this goes away. The main thing that I want to point out on the cap are the Prussian and the Reich cockades. I can't see, so there we go. Yeah, Prussia, Reich. And so the German Empire symbols and the symbols for the Kingdom of Prussia, which is where my officer is from. And so the way that it ends up working is that by the time of the end of the war, I would say that most junior officers are like, as far as like my officer, you know, he would have gone through potentially Tannenberg, Battle of Verdun, the Musarghan offensive, would have gone through a bunch of other battles. And so this definitely would have changed. By the end of the war, he would have looked very, very different because of just the nature of war. But the standard kind of design of the uniform would have remained the same. He probably would have still had a very similar sidearm. And this kind of constitutes the way that the German officer looked throughout World War One, and actually also World War Two. It was a very similar design. I mean, they were still basically being equipped with pistols. Um, Many of them were still being equipped with the Luger, and so this idea of a standard officer's uniform would be the norm, more or less, for um, the overarching idea for the German armed forces till well after World War II. And so this is a World War One officer uniform. Again, it's the Prussian, the East Prussian, the Second East Prussian Grenadier Regiment, um, based out of East Prussia, from the city of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in Russia. So this is how this is my one of my first uniforms, and I will be doing some other videos kind of going more into the history behind each portion of my uniform. Like I said earlier, I'm working on a cavalry uniform. I've also been working for a long time on a standard German infantry uniform, and I'm also making plans to start work on a British infantry officer uniform. So I will have two uniforms, one German, one British, to kind of compare and contrast the difference between both of them. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will hopefully be seeing all of you in a different video where I can do some more history, teach more about history. So that being said, I would like to thank you all very much for watching this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see all of you guys later. Bye.